on BBC One Scotland and on HD. But before that, from warlords to landlords, in the last of our series, the Highland Clans.
Signs and portents, prophecies of doom. The supernatural is closely bound up with the story of Clan MacKenzie.
I'm in the grounds of Bron Castle, once home to the Mackenzie Earls of Seaforth. The flames and music are part of the Festival of Highland Culture, celebrating 1,000 years of tradition.
The Mackenzies were once a mighty clan, but as their fortunes changed, they went from ruthless warlords to cash-strapped landlords. That decline mirrors the destruction of the clan system, which once governed every aspect of life here in the Highlands.
In this series, I'm on a personal journey to reveal the extraordinary and often bloody history of our Highland clans, and there can be few more eerily dramatic than the rise and fall of the Mackenzies. Of all clan castles, Eilean is, for me, the most iconic. And it was here, on the shores of Loch Duich in Kintail, that the Mackenzie story really begins, when Coinneach MacCoinneach, Kenneth son of Kenneth, gave his name to the clan in the 13th century.
The Mackenzies were once the most powerful clan in the north of Scotland. They got to the top by acting as royal agents for a succession of Scottish kings, being in effect the monarchy's strongmen here in this part of the Highlands.
The growth of Mackenzie power nearly always came at the expense of other clans, but especially in the MacLeods of Lewis. In the 1600s, the MacLeods had made the island of Lewis almost ungovernable, and King James VI was desperate to pacify this turbulent part of his kingdom.
It really seems that James VI hated Gaelic culture. He saw Highlanders as mad, bad and barbarous, the very antithesis of civilised society. But because his court in Edinburgh was so far from the Highlands and Islands, he was forced to use a clan on the ground to help him exercise royal authority here. And there was no clan more ambitious or eager to lend a helping hand than the Mackenzies.
King James had tried to subdue the MacLeods by colonising them. But when this ended in bloody disaster, he invited the Mackenzies to pacify Lewis. The rewards were the rich fishing grounds and the whole island, if they could defeat the MacLeods. So it was with royal blessing that Chief Mackenzie of Kintail invaded Lewis with an army of 700 clansmen. Determined to grab MacLeod lands, he went on a bloody rampage.
The Blitzkrieg War, waged by the Mackenzies, forced the MacLeods to the island stronghold of Bursay. Now, they probably felt quite secure there, because Bursay had withstood many a siege in the past, but the Mackenzie clan chief was ruthless as well as cunning.
Not all the MacLeods had been able to reach the safety of the fortress. Mackenzie of Kintail now saw his opportunity. Straggling MacLeod women and children were herded together and rowed out to a rocky island not far from the fortress of Bursay, where they were abandoned to the incoming tide.
Of course, the MacLeods, who could see what was happening from their fortress, were now faced with a stark and a terrible choice. They could either abandon their position and save their loved ones, or they could watch them drown. And as the cries of their wives and their children grew louder and louder, they were really faced with no choice but to surrender to the Mackenzie chief, who now dominated the whole of Lewis.
With Lewis and its valuable fishery under their belts, the Mackenzies became the Earls of Seaforth. And it's as the Earls of Seaforth that they offered to take on another royal enemy, Satan. From now on, the Mackenzie story is increasingly bound up with the supernatural.
In the 16th century, Scotland was gripped by a fear of witchcraft. This was no doubt fueled by James VI's obsession with the supernatural. Now, he'd written a treatise on demonology, which no doubt explains why witch hunting became a surefire way of securing the king's favour.
In the shadow of Edinburgh Castle, where witches were once routinely burned, I met up with historian Louise Yeoman. I wanted to find out how the Mackenzies used the king's paranoia about witchcraft to further their own careers.
Louise, why were people so scared of witchcraft?
Well, because they believed in it. I mean, if you believe somebody could kill your children, afflict you with a hideous illness, reduce you to poverty, take away all your means of making a living, well, you'd be scared. And you'd want the authorities to do something about that.
But how were the Mackenzies able to exploit this fear in society?
Well, the same way as anyone else in the position of magistrate in a part of Scotland could. It was a way in which you could show yourself to be zealous for the king. Now, when they come into Lewis, we're in the reign of James VI and first, everyone associates him with witch hunting. But what they don't realise is witch hunting carries on into the reign of Charles I. And it's at that time the Mackenzies have their great money-making scheme. They're going to bring in the Dutch who do industrial-scale fishing, and they're going to make lots of money from collaborating with them. And this puts Mackenzie in political hot water because the good burghers of Scotland do not want the Dutch coming in and stealing their fish.
Hoping to get out of this political hot water, the Mackenzies tried winning the king's support by persecuting witches. But there were other reasons for the Stornoway witch hunts.
There's another reason why, if you're wanting to make a lot of money out of a fishing station, you might go after witches. And that's because one of the main fears about witches was that they could sink ships, that they could raise storms, that they could raise winds. So you see, this might be why Mackenzie thinks it's worthwhile to go after these women. You don't want witches on the loose when you're trying to turn Stornoway into a sort of international fishing centre, do you?
So the Mackenzies were willing to burn witches to advance their business interests. But perversely, the clan became victims of the dark arts themselves when one of their own claimed supernatural powers. The next stage of my journey takes me back to Braun Castle near Dingwall. For centuries, this was the eastern power base of the Mackenzie Lords of Seaforth.
Not long after the Stornoway witch trial, another Mackenzie emerges from the obscurity of history, Coinach Oa, or the Braun Seer, whose prophecies are said to have foretold the end of the Mackenzie dynasty and the collapse of the Highland way of life.
The Braun Seer, born Kenneth Mackenzie, spent most of his life on the clan estates here at Braun. Andrew Matheson is a distant relative of the Mackenzies who came to fear the prophecies of the Braun Seer.
He was consulted pretty widely by people who wanted to know what was going to happen. And the final thing, the pinnacle of his career, was when he was consulted by Lady Seaforth in Braun Castle, which is where we're standing now. And she wanted to know something that was very important to her, and he eventually was persuaded to tell her, and that was his final downfall.
So what happened? What was he reluctant to tell her about?
Right, well, her husband was away, had been away for quite a long time, and he was having a wonderful time in Versailles. And Lady Seaforth was getting worried and frustrated and cross about his absence. So she called for the Braun Seer and asked what he was doing. Well, the Braun Seer spent a lot of time gazing through his stone and seeing the future. And he told her that this was where Lord Seaforth was, that he was surrounded by all the finery, by lots of lovely ladies, and misbehaving himself thoroughly. And she didn't like that. No woman would like to be told that. So she had him condemned as a witch and was finally rolled down the hill at Fortrose in a barrel of boiling tar.
The Braun Seer met his grisly fate here at Channery Point, as commanded by a vengeful Lady Isabella Seaforth. But as he braved the flames, Coinach Oer made a prophecy that would curse all future generations of the Seaforth Mackenzies. Or so the legend goes. History tells a different, more complex story. According to Alex Sutherland, there are, rather confusingly, two bronze seers, a legendary figure and a real character, Coinach Oer, who was tried for witchcraft.
What we do know is that 9 people died here, both men and women, killed for witchcraft, executed for witchcraft.
Burned to death.
Burned to death in this site here somewhere.
And was Coinach Oer one of these?
Well, that's where the problem sets in, because Coinach Oer of legend and the Coinach Oer of history are not one and the same. The Coinach Oer of history predates the Coinach Oer of legend by about 100 years. Coinach Oer is historical, and the genesis of the Bran Seer legend is this historical Coinach Oer. The legend of the Bran Seer is an amalgam of oral tradition, historical fact, folklore, and literary romance.
So what's happened is that over the years, the story of Coinach Oer and the terrible events that happened here at Channery Point, where these people were burned to death for witchcraft, that entered into the folk culture.
That's correct.
And then a myth is built up around that, and
That's right.
that is the Bran Seer.
That's the Bran Seer. The Bran Seer is a legendary figure. He's not flesh and blood as we would know it.
Alex, why did the legendary character, the Bran Seer, become so important to Highland culture?
In any culture, and the Highland culture in particular, saw a lot of change over the centuries. And when there's change, people try to make sense of those changes. And they often use prophecy as a medium through which to do that. And the Bran Seer became a sort of messianic figure, because when he was put to death, according to the legend, he was a very pious, righteous man. So this sort of gives him some authority, some ability to reprimand, if you like, or censure the social superiors.
He's on the moral high ground, really.
Exactly, yes.
So this legendary bronze seer became a mouthpiece of the people, and his prophecies gave rank-and-file clan members a way to indirectly criticize their chiefs in increasingly troubled times.
For many ordinary people in the Highlands, the legend of the Bronze Seer became a kind of focus for the great changes that were beginning to sweep across Scotland. And these not only altered the fabric of Highland life, but totally transformed the traditional relationship between the chief and his clan.
And it's said the Bronze Seer saw it all coming. In a vision of a menacing cloud, he saw the destruction of the Jacobite army and the deaths of thousands of clansmen at the Battle of Culloden in 1746. And it's further claimed he predicted the brutal Highland clearances of the 18th and 19th centuries, when chiefs and landlords forced the people off the land to make way for more profitable sheep. Whether prophesied or not, turbulent change certainly swept the Highlands in the centuries after the Bronze Seer's death. I met up with writer and historian Jim Hunter at Buncrew Castle, another former Mackenzie home, to find out why clan society fell apart.
A lot of it starts with the Jacobite Rebellion of 1745. It panicked the British government, and they set out not just to crush the Jacobites militarily, which they did at the Battle of Culloden, of course, in 1746, but then and thereafter they set out totally to destroy the clan society that had made it possible for Bonnie Prince Charlie to raise his Highland army in the first place. And part of that was military repression, the burning of homes, the rounding up of cattle, all of that. But much more subtle and ultimately far more effective was the policy of integrating the clan chiefs, as it were, into the British establishment. And in the space of a generation or so, these individuals made this amazing transition, really, from Gaelic-speaking tribal chieftains to southern aristocrats speaking English now with a old Etonian accent. The one thing about clan chiefs that didn't change was that they had always felt themselves to be people of real status. But in this new society, the chief at the top of the pile, what he wants now is money. He has to have money. And somebody at the time actually encapsulated that very neatly. Somebody commenting on this at the end of the 18th century said, where the Highland chief once had to have hundreds of fighting men at his command, now he needs a full purse with lots of guineas.
The aspirations of these wannabe clan aristos, like the Mackenzie Lords of Seaforth, totally transformed Highland society, creating a class divide between the chiefs and their people. This is vividly demonstrated by the new homes they built for themselves. Here they could really flaunt their wealth. As the chiefs began parading themselves in their finery through the streets of Edinburgh and here in Inverness, let's not forget who was footing the bill. Tens of thousands of ordinary clansmen and women who were still living and working off the land. So what was life like for them? Pretty grim by all accounts. The contrast between chief and clan is dramatically brought to life at Newton Moore's Highland Folk Museum, where Bob Powell gave me an insight into how ordinary Mackenzies would have lived. I was amazed at how primitive their homes were. Thatched roofs, turf walls, no windows, where people and animals sheltered together. Well, it's dark, Bob, I'll say that for a start. I mean, where are the candles?
Well, many of these people didn't have candles. They couldn't afford them, because candles were created from tallow. Tallow came from the livestock, but they needed the livestock alive to be able to send them off to market to raise cash to pay their rent.
So, well, what kind of food, what kind of diet would they have had? We're only talking about 150 years ago here in the Highlands. What would people have eaten?
It is basic. The principal crops are going to be oats or sort of beer, which is another primitive form of barley. And if we think about the oats, we're talking about porridge, or oat cakes, the likes of kale that they may have grown within the kale yard, maybe taking nettles, nettle soup, which would be rich in iron, or berries at the right time of year.
I mean, presumably they've got cows, cattle. I mean, that must have been an important part of their diet too.
Well, you would think so, but in reality that wasn't the case, because they needed those cattle alive to be able to sell them to get cash to pay their rent. But the actual management of them was not an easy thing either, because there was no haymaking as such.
There's no haymaking?
No haymaking as such, no. This didn't really come into the main part till the end of the 18th century.
So how did they keep the animals then over winter?
Well, the lucky ones were brought into the byre. I mean, the vast majority would have been outside. But we do know that the ones that were in here, because of the sparsity of feed, that they'd be so weak come springtime, they had to be physically carried out to eat the new shoots that were growing around them to build the strength up again.
So life was bleak indeed, not just for Mackenzies, but for all lowly clansmen and women in the Highlands of the 18th century. A generation after the Battle of Culloden, all the old ties of duty and care seemed to have been broken. And the desperate struggle simply to exist was actually made worse by chiefs whose role it had once been to protect the clan. Here on the west coast, in the district of Assynt, where the old Mackenzie lands run into the sea, are great tracts of empty country. It's a true wilderness landscape, but 200 years ago there were thriving communities here. There's nothing much left of them today, except for an occasional sad heap of stones, all that remains of whole communities, sacrificed to fill the purses of their clan chiefs. According to one landowner, Sir George Mackenzie of Coole, getting rid of the people was part of a great Highland improvement. To paraphrase him, Highlanders were a filthy, lazy race, and removing them from the land would be a great improvement to the entire country. Amazing. A Mackenzie who would once have been a clan chief saying this about his own people. The heartlessness of landowners like George Mackenzie of Coole has come to characterise the story of the Highland clearances. But the reality is perhaps more complicated. While it's true that many clan members were evicted, others actually chose to leave their ancestral lands. Back in the 1780s, a succession of famines made life intolerable here, and many people chose to quit the struggle altogether and to emigrate. A lot of them went to Canada. Now, such was the hemorrhage of manpower that local landowners actually petitioned the government for troops to help them keep people on the land. But what a different story a century later, In 1880, the Mackenzies still living here got notice to quit, but instead of being glad to leave, they now fought to stay.
And when bailiffs arrived in a rowing boat to throw them off the land, they were attacked by women who stripped them naked and forced them back again. Now, a barefaced cheek, you might think, but at least the women had won the right to stay.
I was fascinated by this early example of Highland girl power. To find out more about the role of women during the clearances, I met up with writer and historian Alistair McIntosh at a ruined township. But the glories of a Highland summer forced us to take shelter. The Highland evictions were reported by the London press in an intriguing way, like war reports.
Here, for example, you can see the gunboats being sent into Skye in the 1880s, 1885, and Marines on the march going off to put down rent strikes in response to people being evicted and rent racking that was going on.
This is a very serious thing. These are armed troops, in a sense, being sent to Skye.
Yeah,
and when was
right.
that?
In gunboats. Well, that's 1885.
1880.
Landing in Uig. The irony of all of this is that at the same time as many a Highland son would be fighting in India or whatever to maintain the power of the empire there, back home, their homes were being burnt around their heads. And then if I can show you this picture here, here's a similar illustration from this era of women in the forefront of the battle against the police and Marines being sent in to put down rent strikes. And what's so interesting about this picture is that you can see how the sympathy of the media was with the people. The women are shown as being dignified. Look at this one, she's even smoking a pipe and so on. I mean, these are women with attitude here. And the rowdy rabble is not the women, but rather the police and the Marines coming to turn them off their land. What they were fundamentally fighting for was their sense of community. They understood community as being geographical, as being community of place, but also historical, so that any person was connected intimately with all those who had gone before them. And they saw this being broken up by the Highland clearances, and they were determined to maintain that soul of the people. And when these images, these drawings of women struggling against landed power in the Scottish Highlands reached the genteel London public, I think the public started to waken up to the fact that what landed power was doing was not all that gentrified.
Chiefs and landlords suddenly found themselves cast as villains in the great struggle for the Highlands. With the tide of public opinion moving against them, the callous evictions finally came to a halt. Across the Highlands and Islands, more and more communities now own the ancestral land beneath their feet. Yet it's only since 2003 that the right to buy has been enshrined in law. On the old Mackenzie estates in Assynt, where crofters won the right to buy their land, I met John MacKenzie. His fields are littered with stones that powerfully symbolise the connection between the past and the place he calls home.
Every stone represents the labour expended by my forebears to transform this land from its original virgin condition into land capable of being cultivated and growing crops. They cleared the stones from the surface, and then as the land was being ploughed, each stone that came up would be carried in a creel and deposited in a location that wouldn't otherwise be capable of being cultivated.
It's quite a desperate thing to do, was it not?
Well, I mean, if you look around and see the numerous cairns that there are and attempt to count the stones, it'll give you an indication over the years the amount of effort that's been expended. I remember in my childhood my grandfather cultivating this land. His predecessors had been cleared from Kirkton of Assynt, and the idea that he would actually own the land or his successors would own the land just would never, ever enter into his head. But one thing I'm sure, and that is that he and those of his generation would have been delighted to see the wrongs of the history which were emblazoned on their entire psyche, having been righted, at least in some measure.
Long before the Assynt Crofters won the rights to their land, their former clan chiefs, the Mackenzie Lords of Seaforth, suffered a different fate, an extinction event long ago predicted by the legendary Bronze Seer's final vision of doom.
Now, when the Bronze Seer faced execution, it said he predicted a time when a deaf and dumb Mackenzie lord would outlive each of his 4 sons and die without an heir. He would be the last of the Seaforth Mackenzies.
Some 200 years later, the Bronze Seer's prophecy was eerily fulfilled with the death of Francis Mackenzie Humberston in 1819. His speech and hearing destroyed by scarlet fever, he died a deaf mute, having outlived his 4 sons. The ruins of Fortrose Cathedral, just a few miles from Bron Castle, is where those Mackenzies, cursed by the Bronze Seer, were laid to rest.
Now, Mackenzies have been buried here for generations, and the place is full of them. We've got an Alexander Mackenzie, a John Mackenzie, and a Kenneth Mackenzie here from Torridon. And over here, there's Sir Alexander Mackenzie of Coole, September 1796. And over here, we've got another Mackenzie, Captain Mackenzie, who died in 1872. But this is what I'm really looking for. This is where our Mackenzie chief is buried. Now it says here, underneath this monument are deposited the mortal remains of Francis Humberston, he's the Mackenzie, Lord Seaforth, Baron Kintail, and his 4 sons, William, George, Francis, and another William. And this is significant. It says, in them terminated the male line of the Earls of Seaforth. Now, I can't help thinking that the last hours of Lord Seaforth must have been an agonizing torment, because he knew more than anyone else that his death would fulfill the Bronze Seer's prophecy and mark the end of the entire Mackenzie dynasty.
For me, the death of Lord Seaforth, whether predicted or not, symbolises the final collapse of the old clan system, a society based on kinship and honour. But as we romanticise and dress up the past, it's easy to forget that the reality of Highland life was brutal and bloody. Our ancestors were forced, quite literally, to battle for survival.
In my journey through the history of Scotland's clans, it's the epic struggle for survival that's impressed me most. Now, the old clan system may have died, but there's still much to fight for. In the 21st century, the language, the landscape, and even access to the land itself is far from secure. So for all of us who value our clan heritage, the struggle for the Highlands continues.